So, 3.5 years ago, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was the site of the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in North America. The building still stands empty, but plans were recently announced for a redesigned complex with a sanctuary, a museum, a memorial, and a center for fighting anti-Semitism, and a new Tree of Life non-profit organization that would oversee the renewed physical space and offer programming to counter hatred aimed at Jews and other groups. The three congregations that share that building have been quoted as eager to return, with many saying that it was the pandemic that made their healing even more complicated, having isolated them from one another and from joining together for prayer in person. With that in mind, if we look at this week's Torah reading, Parshat Chukat, it opens up with a very, very bizarre ritual. The Parah Adumah, the red heifer, a person who has been exposed to death, even just being in the same room with a dead person, was rendered ritually impure and was banned from the ancient equivalent of communal prayers, which is to say, bringing a sacrifice and coming to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the ancient Israelite sort of proto-synagogue. Over the last 3 years, we have all been rendered a particular type of impure, or at least have been suspected of possible impurity because of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. We are now beginning to hear rumblings of climbing numbers and different strains. As millions of people around the world perished, communities struggled with having to remain physically separated and longed to find ways to communicate. And we too had been prevented from coming together to our place of worship, unable to be physically together for that which was so important, and that was our communal prayers. And shortly after the pandemic hit, the Conservative Movement's Committee of Jewish Law and Standards issued a series of guidelines for how to halachically navigate the times of a pandemic, including issues whether one could form a minyan online via a platform like Zoom. And now that we have resumed a more congregational life together in person, that same committee are revisiting much of that past guidance to make recommendations regarding which changes are considered halachically valid to keep long-term and which changes should be retired as only applicable b'shas adchak, in the time of an emergency or a crisis. The ritual of the red heifer was a way for our ancestors to deal with death and to heal from it, and to establish a path back to community wholeness. It was a very complicated ritual involving ashes of a perfect red heifer, cedarwood, hyssop, crimson. And when you think about it, there's almost sort of a poetry to it. Blood, ashes, cedar, hyssop, scarlet, water. There was this sort of pure washing that had to take place. And what it did was it rendered a fit person impure, and an impure person, it made them pure. And only then could they re-enter the temple precincts. But as I said, the one who did the actual ritual, by conducting the ritual, became impure and unfit, and in turn, for a while, remained that way. Now, Rabbi Rachel Berenblatt, she suggests that having been exposed to death, we become oriented towards it. It sort of in many ways magnetizes us, aligning us with death and with dying instead of life and living. And the way to undo this magnetization is to come into contact with death a second time through this ritual. And paradoxically, the second contact with death aligns us with life again. Now think about it for a second on a slightly modern level. Think about it. When the virus hit, what did the government start doing immediately? Looking to create a vaccine, right? Well, what is contained within the vaccine? Isn't it strands of the virus? Don't you, when a virus hits, they sort of inject you with a bit of the virus itself? It's exactly what happened with the red heifer. It's exactly what the Torah tells us happened with the Parah Adumah. That you would become, the one that touched it who became impure could only become pure by this ceremony of using its ashes. We don't have such a ritual to perform to clearly mark the division between pure and impure, between times of COVID and post-COVID. But it is time for us to magnetize ourselves back towards life. During the pandemic crisis, many people found joining services via an online platform to be easy. And gosh, let's be totally honest. Isn't it great to come to shul without even having to get out of the house? No need to dress up. No need to worry about distractions from other people. Talking during the sermon, or whatever have you, except for, of course, the occasional accident where people would forget to turn off their microphone or their camera. But in general, it was so much easier. But you know what? Our tradition frowns on this attitude. In fact, it makes rather an extreme statement. As I said in my Shabbat flyer, found in Masechet Brachot. It says that one who has a synagogue in their city but does not enter there to pray is called an evil neighbor. And it then adds, one is prohibited from passing behind a synagogue while the congregation is praying. So, of course, the commentators wonder, why did the rabbis make such an extreme statement? After all, it's perfectly permitted to pray alone when there is no minyan. But actually, it's not such a mystery. The sages very clearly understood that there could not be a community of prayer unless there was a community of relationship, not only with God, but with one another. And a community of relationships only happens when people interact in person. There simply is no substitute for being in the room. In fact, the sages considered the physical presence of the group to be essential to prayer, both to God and to one another. When the Talmud suggests that one is a bad neighbor if there is a shul, but one doesn't regularly go there, it asserts the importance of the primary locus of Jewish identity, the communal. Jewish prayer is much more effective when we are together. Because when we are together, we shore each other up. The wicked and the good, the young and the old, the strong and the weak can rely on one another and look out for one another. So when is a time of favor? The Talmud asks. The time when the congregation is praying together. The Holy One, God, blessed be He, says, anyone who engages in Torah study and acts of kindness and prays with the congregation, I ascribe to their credit as if they redeem my children and me from among the nations of the world. You know, it's not a coincidence that the language of the verse used here echoes the idea which we repeat in the Amidah of the gathering of our dispersed people among the nations. The Talmud's sages even made that connection very explicit, saying that the bad neighbor who declines to enter the shul physically but merely listens from out back causes himself and their family to be driven into exile. This is intended to be very melodramatic, of course. Still, it echoes the natural force of feeling that the sages had for the necessity of joining together in person as a community and building an identity as a group. And when a person chooses to listen in without entering and being there in the intimacy of physical presence, it contributes to the degeneration of the synagogue and the degeneration of its members. The exile mentioned by the Talmud is, in a sense, very literal. When people call it in, literally, instead of being present, eventually it is inevitable that the physical presence will disappear. The connections will dissipate. The shul will close, and the community will be dispersed. In a time of emergency, of course, we don't want to expose one another to illness and death. But it is essential to reorient ourselves to life. And to do so, we need to be in the room so that if someone falls, we can put our hand out to help them and stand up. Just look around us today. And I hate to do this, but we're doing the same now for Joelle. In her time of need, she came to shul today physically so that we can give her a hand and we can say how much we care and we care for what you're going through at this time. Isn't that preferred than sitting at home and looking at a screen? We can't do that over Zoom. And without it, there is no community. Now, of course, there are such people as the elderly members who can no longer drive, or physically disabled folk, people who have challenging time coming to shul. We're not talking about that. We have other people who cannot get vaccinated for medical reasons, and there'll always be a level of danger being in crowds. We're not talking about them either. It's good to offer an opportunity to participate remotely for those who cannot participate physically. But for those of us who are healthy, those of us who are vaccinated, there's genuinely no reason and no substitute than being together in person. But the necessity of some individuals to join via Zoom only adds to the urgency of everyone else who can show up in person. A strong, physically present minyan builds and maintains the community that these individuals rely upon. Not only for prayer, but also for relationships and helping hands. The physical gathering is the core where we weave together the people who need to be remembered and who need us to go out and to assist in person. Participating in a service electronically is not the same experience as being together in person. And when one prays at home, one is surrounded by all sorts of distractions: dishes, mail, bills, endless cleaning. It's impossible to raise our voice together in song remotely. The laws of physics don't permit it yet. The camaraderie of being together with our fellow Jews is missing when we are all at home looking at screens. And of course, the physical place makes a heck of a difference. Yes, we say in our prayers, Melol kol ha'aretz kavodo. God's glory is everywhere. Yet, there are places where it's easier to sense God's glory. We have a beautiful synagogue, designed as a space for us to feel God's presence easier. It's a space designed to inspire and associate and be associated with many memories and spiritual memories, including B'nai Mitzvah, high holidays, and more. There are a few tragedies in this week's parsha. You probably picked up on them as Ariel was reading. You probably read the death of Miriam and Aaron. The death of Aaron was a very sad scene. Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's son Eliezer climb up to Mount Hor. And Moses is ordered to strip Aaron of his vestments and put them onto Eliezer. And Aaron then dies on the mount. When Moses and Eliezer come down without Aaron, the Torah says the whole community knew that Aaron had breathed his last breath. And all the house of Israel bewailed Aaron for 30 days. But after the 30 days, they were told to resume the journey to the promised land. To look to the future. A journey with challenges. A journey with problems. A journey with battles. But a journey nonetheless. I've got news for you. The time has come, a similar time, for us to resume our journey and to make an effort to physically journey together, even if it's not quite as convenient as Zoom. Ultimately, it'll be a heck of a lot better for you and for the entire community. Shabbat Shalom. This time I just want to recognize the birthdays and the anniversaries to Sandra and Lionel Kudzanowski, to Arlene and Alan Abramovich, and to Lynn